Okay, Kennedy. Just ignore that. I'm still on Zoom. Um, Kennedy and his Cold War, a little bit about his domestic policies. Kennedy is not president for that long. There's a little bit about Johnson in there at the end, but he does make a good impact, a significant impact, on foreign policy, how we deal with the Soviets, and then also domestic policy. When he is president, he doesn't get very much of his domestic policy agenda through. But Johnson is able to use his memory, his legacy, whatever you want to call it, and get some more of those programs passed. So, Kennedy's election in 1960 is pretty important. He's going to run against Richard Nixon, who, as we know, will be elected in 68, but he's a Democrat, John F. Kennedy. They have very different personalities, he and Nixon. Kennedy is seen as, so much younger and this charismatic, good-looking guy, and Nixon is this old kind of policy nerd with balding hairline, and he doesn't hold up well on the televised debate stage. So Nixon and Kennedy in 1960 will participate in the country's first televised debate, and you can see them pictured there. I'm going to play a little bit of this. It's an hour long, so I'm obviously not going to play the whole thing. But the story goes that prior to the debate, both candidates were asked if they wanted like face powder, like you do on television. And Kennedy accepted, and Nixon did not. And Nixon just comes across very pale and sweaty on camera, and Kennedy comes across calm, cool, and collected. And you can even just see here, Nixon, he doesn't know what to do with his body, how he's sitting and where his hands are. Kennedy just looks so much more comfortable and at ease. And that's 9/10 of the presidency, right? Is looking the part. He looks the part. He looks presidential. He looks like he projects strength. So even though Nixon has a substantial amount of credentials when it comes to foreign policy and leadership ability, Kennedy comes across as the stronger, more experienced leader.
Americans, wage security system. The advice.
I want to play.
Even though there is a hungry world.
A little bit of them sitting together. There we go.
In a series of 4 joint appearances, the subject matter has been agreed will be restricted to internal or domestic American matters. And now for the first opening statement by Senator John F. Kennedy.
Okay. So how do we best contain communism? JFK advocates for something called a flexible response. If you remember Eisenhower, who he is replacing, Eisenhower advocated for massive retaliation. Massive retaliation means the ability to completely wipe your enemy off the map if they do something even small, right? So I jostle you in the hallway, you turn around and punch me in the face, right? That's massive retaliation. Flexible response means that we're going to build up our military to the point where we have options other than simply nuclear weapons. This is how, though, we get ourselves into situations like Vietnam, for example, right? That we are going to be able to have a smaller military response to various concerns around the world, not just a gigantic nuclear response. So it allows us, for example, to focus again on Latin America, where there are that's a typo, sorry, where there are poor economic conditions that the concern is will allow for the rise of left-wing extremists. We need to install governments in there, ideally that improve conditions in Latin America, but we'll settle for that are just strong enough to keep the communists out. So JFK is elected president in 1960 and advocates for flexible response as his military policy. He will, though, also triple the amount of nuclear bombs in the American arsenal. Here he is arm wrestling on nuclear weapons with Khrushchev, that's the USSR leader. It's going to be Kennedy also that gets us into the space race. He says, I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon. And of course we do. It signals to the world that we're here and that we're a major player in this game. The Soviets are the first to space, though. They launched the satellite Sputnik in 1957, and in 1961, Yuri Gagarin goes to space. We will send a man to space, John Glenn, in 1962, and in 1968, we have Saturn V, we have the Apollo missions on the moon. In 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins participate in a moon landing on July 20th. Now, we don't win the space race, right? So what we do is we move the goal. We're not the first to space. We don't have the first satellite in space. We don't have the first man in space. That's Yuri Gagarin. But we do have the first man on the moon. And so we just redefine what the space race is, and then we say we won. I like it. Cuba is probably what we remember. If we think about Kennedy and the Cold War and Cold War foreign policy, we think about Cuba. We think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we're going to talk about in a second. But first, we should think of the Bay of Pigs. In 1959, Fidel Castro takes over Cuba. And under Eisenhower, he and his administration had come up with this Bay of Pigs invasion plan. But it will be Kennedy who actually authorizes the invasion. He authorizes the mission. It involved refugees, Cuban exiles who had been in the United States, were trained by CIA officers, CIA members, who would then return to Cuba and overthrow the Cuban government. They were going to land their boats at the Bay of Pigs. The plan was that they were going to go straight into Havana, that people were going to march in the streets to greet them, that they were going to join with them in the cause of revolution, and that Fidel Castro would be overthrown. What happens instead is that they are immediately apprehended as soon as they land on the beach. They are disgraced and paraded through Havana as an example of what not to do. People do not join with them. And the Americans who had promised air support to these invaders never provide that air support. They sort of see where this is headed. It is a huge embarrassment for Kennedy. You can see this political cartoon. The chickens have come home to roost at the White House, form of the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy will also have to deal with the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961. USSR Premier Khrushchev and Kennedy will meet. Khrushchev will demand that the U.S. withdraw from West Berlin. Remember, Berlin is a capitalist island in this communist sea. And when Kennedy refuses, that is when the Berlin Wall is constructed. And later on, we'll see Reagan standing at the wall saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." But it does become a symbol of Cold War divisions. The Cuban Missile Crisis takes place in 1962. It is the closest the world comes to nuclear war at any point during the Cold War. Essentially, remember that Fidel Castro is communist. He's taken over Cuba. Cuba is a communist country now. They have established an alliance with Khrushchev and the Soviets. And U.S. spy planes, satellite imagery, comes back and reveals that the Soviets have placed a weapons base on Cuba. Now, Cuba is only 90 miles off the shore of Florida. This is terrifying for Americans. Eventually, through a series of negotiations that take place over 13 days, Kennedy and Khrushchev decide that the missiles will be removed from Cuba, and that 1 month later, the Americans will remove our missiles from Turkey. And that is a compromise that is acceptable to everyone. The U.S. had instituted a blockade against Cuba where no supplies could go in. And so Cuba was being cut off from the rest of the world, from vital supplies. And the Americans also didn't want to remove their missiles from Turkey because Kennedy didn't want to be accused of being soft on communism or of appeasement. So the Soviets said, okay, you can do it a month later to sort of save face. There seem to be two versions of Soviet leadership at play here. Khrushchev as a more moderate voice, and then there were hardliners. And sometimes there would be like communications coming through from the Soviets that tended to take a more hardline approach. And sometimes you would hear from Khrushchev and his moderates. And Kennedy and his team made a very conscious decision to only engage with the moderate message that they were receiving, which proved to be the correct decision to make.
On October 22nd at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, President Kennedy gave the scariest speech ever given. I defy anybody to find one that scared more people more profoundly than that speech.
We knew it was going to be about Cuba. It was going to be about Cuba, and it was not going to be good.
They announced the president will speak with the nation, and asked my father what it would be about. He told, I think that they discovered the missiles in Cuba.
Up until that moment, they thought they had gotten away with the secret deployment and implementation of these missiles in Cuba. But at that moment, this plan is exposed.
He asked the members of the Soviet leadership to come to Kremlin, and there they waited what the president would say. And if they declare invasion, it will be very dangerous.
They all expect that Kennedy would announce an attack. And what Khrushchev says during that session is really interesting. He is not his normal flamboyant, we will bury them kind of guy. He says, well, we will respond if they attack, but that might mean a big war. And you can see that he is really grappling with the possibility of a real nuclear war.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
I tried to put some language in the speech that indicated that we were prepared to do what we had to do if we had to do it, but we preferred the blockade, which in effect put the ball in Khrushchev's court.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response on the Soviet Union.
Pretty chilling line.
And these actions may only be the beginning. Thank you and good night.
Kennedy is going to also have a domestic program that he names the New Frontier. And so your textbook is going to refer to the New Frontier and the Great Society as hand in hand, because New Frontier is Kennedy. Think about space, right? The final frontier. The New Frontier is Kennedy, and Johnson has the Great Society. He famously says, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. He asks for more money for education, for health insurance for the elderly. He establishes a Department of Urban Affairs, but he doesn't win like a huge, overwhelming victory. And so he needs Southern Democrats to get on board with his plans, or else nothing is going to happen. And we talked a little bit about that in the civil rights conversation that we had. He does have some successes, job creation. The space program, for example, helps with that. But his tax cut fails. He fails to get money for senior health insurance. He fails to get money for education. So he does have a lot of domestic failures. Inclusion is probably one of his legacies. Establishing a presidential panel on mental retardation, which of course is not a term that we use anymore, but Kennedy had a sister who is mentally handicapped, and so he focuses a good deal on that. His sister, Eunice Shriver, establishes the Special Olympics. He appoints a woman, Esther Peterson, to serve as the Assistant Secretary of Labor and Director of a new Women's Bureau of the Labor Department. And he, in 1961, establishes the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. The court is another large legacy of his, the Warren Court. In 1953, Earl Warren becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, where he remains during Kennedy's presidency. And the Warren Court is one of the more powerful courts in our Supreme Court history. It's kind of like the Marshall Court, right? And all of the categories of rulings kind of fall into due process, prayer and privacy, reapportionment, and there is a list of Warren Supreme Court cases in your folder as well.
In this edition of the History Channel.
Okay, I'll move through that. And then the assassination of Kennedy takes place on November 22nd, 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald is the lone assassin. The Warren Commission is named after this. The Warren Court, right? The Warren Commission, Chief Justice Earl Warren is going to look into exactly what happens with the assassination. It's determined that he is the lone assassin. He will be killed and turned by a nightclub owner in Dallas, Texas, named Jack Ruby. LBJ will take up the mantle of his presidency and get a lot of his domestic reforms passed in the form of the Great Society. Expanding contributions, financial contributions of Medicare and Medicaid, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which includes money for Head Start programs, Title I funds, poverty rate does dip under Johnson. Of course, it climbs again. All right. Oh, that last little comment there, to what extent did the Vietnam War impact the legacy of the Great Society? Remember that Johnson is spending a whole lot of money on the Vietnam War. That's money that he has to take away from his Great Society programs and funnel into the war effort. So had it not been for the Vietnam War, the domestic spending on the Great Society could have been much more New Deal-like. There's a separate little video on the Great Society in your folder as well. So this is just a little brief overview of Kennedy and Johnson, and let me know if you've got questions about anything.